Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Student journalists have been in the spotlight in recent years. In 2024, amid massive on-campus protests, people often turn to student outlets like Columbia University's WKCR for the most up-to-date reporting. But practicing journalism as a student comes with risk.
Police arrested the 19-year-old freshman on June 5th as he was covering a protest for the school newspaper, the Stanford Daily.
Those risks have become even more clear in recent weeks. Tufts University graduate student Rümeysa Öztürk was detained in March after the Trump administration revoked her visa. U.S. District Judge William Sessions ordered her release on May 9th, saying the only evidence given for her detention was an op-ed she wrote for her school paper. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the ways that student journalism shapes our society today. Later in the show, we hear from students who talk about their experiences in their own words. Up first is Gary Green. He's executive director of the Student Press Law Center. The organization supports First Amendment rights for student journalists. Ask Gary to tell me about the challenges that student journalists face.
I'm so glad you asked that because a lot of people that I talk with when I tell them about the mission of the Student Press Law Center really don't understand the critical role that student journalism plays in our news and information ecosystem. They don't understand the challenges that young people face in those spaces. And they don't understand really the existential crisis that student journalism and journalism education is facing. A large part of that is that they can be censored. There are a couple of court cases that have really set the stage for what student journalists can say and when they cannot be censored by administrations. And we're living in a time now when powerful people and powerful institutions don't necessarily like when people are writing stories about them that might make them feel uncomfortable or bring unwanted attention to their institution. So we really try to step in to make sure that those student journalists have the legal support that they need. If you're a professional journalist, you have a legal department. You have resources that go and fight for you that allow you to do that really important work. When a student journalist faces a barrier, many times they don't know where to turn. And in most cases, we are their legal department. We are their legal education and training, but we're also their frontline defense when they're facing censorship and somebody tries to shut them down and silence them.
I agree with you totally as someone who's been a professor for the better part of 20 years, been on college campuses for many more years than I would like to admit to. I think people take for granted what it means to be a student journalist, to stand in that gap, to say, yes, we are defenders of truth, we are conveyors of information, but it is risky because students are so vulnerable by the very fact that they are students, that they may be dependent on university funding support or the ability to even have access to that information. And yet, Gary, we know that student journalists have really been on the front lines for years, for decades, of getting that news out and talking not just about their particular campus, but how some of these things are playing out. Can you give us a couple of examples of how student journalists have really promoted that form of democracy or change via their work?
To your point, student journalists have been doing really important work since, for decades. I mean, I look back at the Vietnam War when the photograph of the Kent State shootings was captured by a student journalist. And that was a real pivotal moment in that war and our country's reaction to it. But for many, many years, student journalists just kind of went on and did their work. And I don't think the mainstream population really understood the value of what they're contributing to our news and information ecosystems. But with the decline of legacy news and the disruption that's happening in media and information, student journalists now are really providing some of the most critical stories coming to our communities and places where, in some cases, there are no more primary news sources beyond student journalists. They've brought down university presidents. They've brought down, venerable football coaches at colleges. They have covered college protests for the world in a way that Many other campuses they didn't have professional journalists on those campuses. They weren't allowed in, and student journalists were the first documenters of that history. Without those student journalists on the front lines, we're missing just a huge part of what's happening in our communities. But their ecosystem is fragile and they need help. And they are losing funding and they're losing support in many places. And we've got to do everything we can to let our audiences know that student journalists, student journalism is really the seedbed of democracy. It's the seedbed of the US journalism industry. And if we don't support them now, we're going to have a real problem just a few years down the road. So they need our help, and we're proud to be there to help them. But I'm here telling anybody who's listening to your show that it's got to go way beyond SPLC. We need everybody to join in this fight.
What are you seeing when you speak with student journalists and their organizations? What are you hearing from them? What are you seeing in their experiences that really means we should sound the alarm, as you just mentioned, of this cannot just be the work of your organization, but something we all should be concerned about?
That's a great question. The baseline theme here is the more important your work is to their community, the more threats you're going to have coming at you for doing that work. The more accountability journalism that student journalists are putting out there that have a large impact on their community means that they're going to be the target of threats. We have seen student journalists, I think of the US Freedom Tracker last year showed that of all arrests of journalists, 21% were student journalists. We're seeing financial cuts. In some cases, 100% funding has been cut from student media in colleges. Other times it's 80%. And then other times it's 10%, 15%, what we call the death by 1,000 cuts. It's hard to say that they're doing it because of content, but it's also pretty likely that they're doing it because student journalists have become a problem and they're asking questions that, administrators really don't want to answer. And, in just so many cases, these student journalists are feeling the same pressures that our professionals are. They're getting doxxed, they're getting threatened, they're getting intimidated, their sources are afraid to talk to them, and they really have to be brave and courageous to go out there and do this work. And yet I'm here in New York right this week at a student journalism conference, and there are hundreds and hundreds of brave, courageous young people inspired to go into this field despite all of that. So it gives me hope. I also see that the work that they're doing is rebuilding that trust in the community that we've lost with the decimation of local news. So, we want to give them the tools. We want to give them the courage to go forward because the work that they're doing, it's going to help bring us all in from the margins. And I don't believe people look at a student journalist who's 17 years old and says, you're the enemy of the people. So I think that they have that kind of built-in trust a little bit more than our national news that's pushing us out to the edge. And so we want to fuel that work so they can bring us all together, recreate that sense of community, recreate that trust, and hopefully bring the temperature down a little bit and create some encouraging dialogue in our communities.
I think, Gary, we don't give young people enough credit. We assume that they need to just stand on the sidelines and wait for an opportunity when we decide that they're ready. And as you said, these are young people, 16, 17 and up, who are paying attention, who are keenly aware that what's happening in the world is not right. And they're willing to ask the question of why and not just accept the status quo, but also not being willing to just be pushed to the side. And at the same time, we are seeing determined attacks on education that include making decisions about what kinds of programs get supported in colleges and universities, what are the career pathways that students have, and how we make investments in what we think those pathways should be. What is the implication for how journalism is taught in schools, or how colleges and universities are creating these opportunities, and what that means, as you said, that long-time trajectory of how they move from student journalists to professional journalists? What's the implication for education?
I would say, and I don't choose this word lightly, that we have a crisis in journalism education. It has just by and large lost a lot of institutional support. There was a student media organization that was shut down recently, and one of the reasons that was cited was a lack of cultural support for journalism. And that's just staggering to me. And I think that that is the work of some larger forces in our society. And so what I'm trying to explain to people is that we need to start investing in journalism education at a much, much younger age. Journalism is a vehicle through which we teach civics, we teach government, we teach communication skills, we teach research skills, and we also are largely teaching how to differentiate between fact and fiction and misinformation and disinformation and really propaganda, which is going to play a really big part of our information systems going forward. So we need to start investing in journalism and having journalism experiential opportunities in K through 12, so that by the time students get into college, they already have a really clear understanding of how the media system works and how it plays into our democratic society and our government institutions. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is journalism classes are being shuttered. They're being turned into clubs. They're being they're really being marginalized in a way that I think has huge ramifications down the line. And the analogy that I use is, if we heard today that math was no longer popular or it had lost its institutional support, we wouldn't cancel math classes, because we understand math is a critical component to educating a functioning society. Well, my argument is we need to look at journalism the exact same way, because journalism is one of those courses that can really, it can serve society in a way that teaches us how our society functions, how our democratic systems function. And if we eliminate that education and we take away those learning opportunities, we will not have a free press that is functional.
I want to be really particular here and put a fine point on this. We are in an era where there are a lot of people who have smartphones and can put their opinions out there into the public ether very quickly. That is not journalism. There is a skill, there is a fact verification, an editing process that goes into journalism that traditionally has raised that public trust, because we knew that there was a way and a method to that. And so by equipping people with those skills of journalism, of verify, wanting to be accurate and not just first, the ways that we can help have a more productive society, and I think have a more informed public that can resist some of that pull of misinformation and disinformation. I want to go back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago, because I think it connects to this point of why having a more civically literate society could benefit all of us. You said that some 20% of the journalists who have been arrested have been students. That's a staggering number. What are those arrests about? What is that for? Because I think it helps us understand the resistance that some people feel toward truth tellers and truth seekers.
We represented two cases last year that were pretty high profile. One was at Dartmouth, where our now student board member, Charlotte Hampton, was arrested covering protests. And she was there with a large pool of other professional media. And she was detained and arrested unlawfully, and we fought to get, her charges dropped. And she's still actually working to get her record expunged from the university. And then there was another student out at the Daily Stanford at Stanford University who was arrested covering protests there on the college campuses. I think a big part of it is that students are now, as they have been since, again, back in the Kent State shootings, but students are on the front lines of some very controversial news events, and they're putting themselves in position to cover the story, but they're also putting themselves in position to run into conflict with law enforcement. And I feel like there is just a total lack of respect of our laws with regards to the free press, and that it's arrest first and we'll figure it out later sort of thing. And, as my editors always told me, it's really hard to cover the story from the back seat of a patrol car. So be real careful when you want to push that line. I think the line has moved. And so, I think students, by injecting themselves into really important, critical stories across our country, are finding themselves in the crosshairs of law enforcement more than they used to be. And so, the other thing that I want to also point out to you, to go back to one of your previous points, is when we look at journalism education now, I'm not saying that if we start journalism education in kindergarten or even news literacy and understanding how news and information flows is going to necessarily create, you know, just generations of people going into journalism as a profession. What it's going to do is it's going to educate generations of people about the role of journalism and how to decipher different forms of information, especially when there is so much misinformation out there. To be able to teach a young person how to vet information, how to decipher whether it's fake, where the primary source is, and understand how it's distributed and throughout technology, that's going to create that next generation of literacy within our news and information system. And then maybe that 5% or 10% go on to become student journalists and go into this field. And that's fine. Like, we don't need everybody that needs to be a journalist. We just need everybody to understand the work that they do is really valuable and to respect the work that they're doing, support it financially, and then support them when they have pressures from above that are trying to silence them.
What do you say to young people, to student journalists who feel like, I'm drawn to this, but there's so many pressures and so many detractors, whether it's the changing landscape of professional media or just the kind of attacks that they're facing? What advice do you give to young people?
I've been kind of saying over the last couple of weeks and months that we need to find a way to make journalism cool again. That it was just one of the most incredible career choices when I got into this. And it was a license to meet anybody, to talk to anybody, to go anywhere. And it was literally a front row seat to life, a way to experience the world and cultures that you just don't do in other ordinary fields. And I try to remind them, as heavy as this feels, yes, our generation is saying you have to save democracy. Everything is on your shoulders. And I've had a lot of young people say, you know what, Gary, that's not the best pitch. You know what? We don't necessarily want to fix the problem that your generation is handing over to us. So I've changed my storyline and I've let them know that, yes, it is hard. And yes, there are threats out there. And yes, there are challenges and there is an unstable business model. But the core of this profession remains that there is no better education in the world than being a journalist and being able to experience people and culture and places in a way that a journalist can. So I try to remind them that it's fun.
We've talked a lot about young people, the advice you would give to them. What do you say to the public overall about how we need to really focus on the importance of student journalism and its connections to all of the ways that we interact? What's that message for the general public?
I think the message to that general public is really that student journalism is playing a much, much larger role in our communities than a lot of people realize. And that role helps build community, as I mentioned earlier. It helps build trust. And we need that community and trust more today than at any point in my lifetime. And in so many of our communities, we have lost community and trust because we've lost local news. And when we lose local news, we know that civic engagement goes down. We know that government corruption goes up. We know that financial malfeasance goes up. And we need to support the students that are really out there covering our community in a way that nobody else is doing. And in many ways, if you don't have a student journalist at your school board meeting, you might not have a journalist there at all. If you don't have a student journalist going to your city commission or county commission meeting, you likely don't have a journalist in the room at all. If you don't have a student journalist writing a story about your hometown hero, the features on the people that make our community special, the stories about ordinary people living extraordinary lives and doing extraordinary things, we don't hear those stories anymore. And that helped bring us all to the table to have really deep intellectual dialogue about the things that are important to us. And we've lost that in the last decade. So they need financial help. They need our moral help. They just need societal support. And we need to just let people know that we don't want to lose this. Once it's gone, it's going to be really hard to get back. So let's all work together today to save this fourth estate, save this institution that's so vital to us.
Gary, you've reminded me that the way that we can survive and navigate the challenges we face collectively are to really embrace that idea that we need each other. That it's not just about what we can do for student journalists. It is also a respect and recognition of what they do for us, and how in that common, connected, mutual destiny we can move forward. Gary Green is Executive Director of the Student Press Law Center. The organization supports First Amendment rights for student journalists. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure talking with you today.
Coming up, a group of student journalists talks about covering the universities they attend. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the role of student journalists in our communities. To hear firsthand what it's like to be a student journalist, we invited a panel of student journalists to share their experiences. The panel was hosted by our intern, Kathy Wang. Kathy is a student journalist at Brown University. She was senior editor of the Brown Daily Herald from December 2023 to December 2024. Maria Sheikh is managing editor at The Retrograde. It's an independent student newspaper at the University of Texas at Dallas. Annika Aurora Seth was editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News from spring 2023 to spring 2024. And Macy Hanslick-Barrand is a news and arts director at WKCR. It's Columbia University's independent, student-run radio station. I'll let Kathy take it from here.
So, student journalism has been in the spotlight in recent years, and I'm just wondering where you all think its importance lies in today's world. Annika, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that in our current political climate, a number of the most prevalent and hot-button issues are directly about our universities and college campuses, and I'm thinking specifically about affirmative action, about these questions about DEI in university settings, about critical studies departments, critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. And that's before we even get to last year's swirling campus tensions around the war in Gaza and resultant protests about that on American college campuses. And so I believe that student journalism is incredibly important for a lot of reasons, but in this current political climate, because it offers a more direct and more culturally conscious, I would say, understanding of these issues as they manifest on university campuses.
Maria, do you want to go next?
Sure. Definitely agree with everything that Annika said. On top of that, one thing I've found personally is the role student journalism plays as often the front lines of hyperlocal journalism, right? I've met plenty of student journalists who have communities that are served pretty much exclusively by the student paper. Our own Richardson, Texas, for example, does not have its own local newspaper. So if we're going to be talking about Richardson mayoral elections, if we're going to be talking about anything local going on in the Richardson area, people are getting that news from us instead of, another outlet, perhaps.
Macy, do you want to, last but not least, do you want to also answer the question?
Yeah, I think student journalism also exists outside of the bounds and pressures of a lot of in national for-profit newsrooms, which is really important. And kind of as Maria was saying, student journalists have a much deeper understanding of the populace they report on than a lot of national reporters. And because of that, there is a trust between student journalists and not only the student body, but also the larger community, which I think just creates a lot more nuanced and poignant coverage of events that get, blown up and potentially misreported on by other outlets.
Yes, definitely. And I think, to that community point, I think college campuses are places with really tight communities. And, you know, I think student journalism is unique because of exactly what each word represents. We're both students and journalists. So how do you navigate the experience of being part of the very community you're reporting on? And what is that like for you? Macy, do you want to speak to this first? You know, especially given WKCR's 24-hour live coverage of protests last spring.
Yeah, I think one thing that we found really important was not ignoring the fact that you're a part of the community you're reporting on. Again, I think that really informs your coverage and actually makes it a lot more accurate and nuanced. So, for example, during the protests on Columbia's campus in the spring of 2024, acknowledging the impact that seeing police presence on campus has on a student journalist who, again, is also a member of the community and is watching their own campus be thrown into turmoil is really important.
Yes, yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think, you know, this is also definitely the coverage is connected to another really important topic, which is the independence of student publications, you know, both editorial independence and financial independence. Annika, do you want to speak first to, you know, how we maintain this editorial independence?
If a large part of a newspaper's coverage is and should be covering the administration, critically thinking about what faculty goings on are happening, etc., then that's also kind of hard to do, especially on a campus as small as ours, where in many cases you know these administrators pretty well. You might have had classes with these professors, maybe your friends have classes with these professors. Um, and even on just the student coverage of things too, it's what, a 6,000 person or so undergraduate student body. So you kind of know everyone by junior year. I mean, I had moments my sophomore year where I'd covered a story or a protest or quoted someone in something or any of these things. And I would, you know, at night, like have taken a shower, come back into my common room, and the person that I quoted is like a sweet mate's friend who's sitting on my couch and is like, "Why did you quote me like that, Annika?" And I'm like, "I'm in a towel and you are in my home. We're not talking about this right now."
Yeah, so Maria, do you want to talk about more about like the kind of unique situation at UTD and its student paper?
Last May, we had a historic campus protest where 21 peaceful protesters were arrested in a show of significant police violence on campus, certainly the largest protest and largest arrest cases that has ever happened on our campus. And we covered this at the Mercury as breaking news. Admin didn't like that coverage. And ultimately, the conflict between us and them led to them demoting our editor-in-chief, led to them firing our editor-in-chief, as well as demoting our faculty advisor at the time, after which the rest of the Mercury staff, with me being acting editor-in-chief for them, kind of leading them in that way, decided to go on strike. We were like, hey, we don't want to work at this paper where administration feels comfortable removing editors because they think that under that editor's leadership, the paper is doing critical journalism that makes the university look bad. For to be frank, I we were uncomfortable with any kind of notion that student journalism should be censored to appease administration or should not tell the truth properly because in our conversations with industry experts, with student media mentors, since we were told over and over, you know, the coverage you've done is accurate and fair. Obviously, there are places we can improve, but admin saying this is journalistic malpractice, this is not allowed, you should not have done this, was completely wrong of them and speaks to them trying to silence an independent and critical student voice. And we were like, you know, they're coming after our editor in chief. They're uninterested in negotiating with us. We cannot work under these conditions, but we want to continue doing student journalism, which led to us launching The Retrograde as a completely independent, nonprofit, student run publication. And we're coming up soon in a couple of months on one full academic year in operation. And the lessons I've learned about editorial and especially financially independent student journalism have numbered so many in the past year, but certainly the main takeaway that I have is you you're going to have a harder time going independent for sure. You're going to want for money. In the beginning, you're going to be mainly or entirely volunteer run, even at the highest position. You're going to be missing the cushy stipends and the university paychecks, the university office, and the university resources. But if when it comes to having all those amenities versus being able to do the journalism the community needs. I remember being outside the jailhouse last May where the 21 people who were arrested were being kept, and other reporters were there too. And I read their stories after the fact. Ours was the most accurate in terms of details by far. And it shocked me. And I just remember thinking, without student journalists being here on the scene to do this work, without us being allowed to do this work, if we were, perhaps punished for doing this work, which we were, then incorrect information about this historic moment would have proliferated and become the dominant narrative.
We reached out to the University of Texas at Dallas for a statement. They told us, quote, UT Dallas has always supported student journalists' editorial control and wants to create an environment where they can learn best journalistic practices and follow best professional standards and guidelines. For clarification, the former editor was not removed for editorial content, and the assistant director of student media was not demoted. He served in an interim capacity only as director of student media. A working group of university faculty, students, and staff has worked over the past few months to create a new advisory committee for student media, with the goal of bringing the student newspaper back into publication and providing them with the necessary resources they need to function with editorial independence critical for student journalists. End quote. You're listening to a student journalism panel hosted by our intern, Kathy Wang. Kathy's a student journalist at Brown University. She was senior editor of the Brown Daily Herald from December 2023 to December 2024. Maria Sheikh is managing editor at The Retrograde. It's an independent student newspaper at the University of Texas at Dallas. Annika Aurora Seth was editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News from spring 2023 to spring 2024. And Macy Hanslick-Barrand is a news and arts director at WKCR. It's Columbia University's independent, student-run radio station. Coming up, we'll hear more from our panel of student journalists. They'll offer advice to future student journalists about topics like receiving criticism and dealing with conflicts with university administrations. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're discussing what student journalists mean to our communities. Before the break, you heard a panel discussion featuring student journalists that our intern, student journalist Kathy Wang, hosted. We now return to more of that conversation. Annika Aurora Seth was editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News from spring 2023 to spring 2024. Macy Hanslick-Barrand is a news and arts director at WKCR. It's Columbia University's independent, student-run radio station. And Maria Sheikh is managing editor at The Retrograde. It's an independent student newspaper at the University of Texas at Dallas. And now I'll throw it back to Kathy.
So I'm wondering how you see student journalism playing a role in the local news crisis and what's unique about student journalists' coverage of city news, because sometimes we have this closer relationship with our own communities, but when it comes to city news, it's like we're students, why are we covering the city when there are also maybe professional journalists who are working at the same time to cover those news? Annika, do you want to also talk more about the relationship between Vidia and New Haven?
Yeah, sure. New Haven also has quite prolific local papers. Shout out the New Haven Independent and the New Haven Register. Love them. But what I think is important with Yale and like these sorts of elite private institutions specifically is what the relationship between the institution and the city is broadly. And I think that's important for two reasons. One, there is a good amount of mistrust in local community here toward anything that has like the Yale name on it, and that includes the Yale Daily News, given an often described as financially exploitative relationship between the university and the city. But also, I think far too many students come to Yale and they're living in New Haven by virtue of being at Yale and know very little about New Haven and haven't engaged very much with the city. And so questions that I would love to or like want to ask and try and answer are like, how do we write the story in a way that's going to be engaging to your average Yalie, right? How are we going to make Yale students care about New Haven through our reporting and want to engage more with the city and learn more about Yale New Haven relations? And that's not necessarily like the primary or only objective. I think it is still important to cover a city for the city's sake, even if like there are other papers doing the same thing, because there is no shortage of unexplored and untapped news stories, and we always need more accountability journalism. And that's not less important because we're a student paper.
Now we're going to pivot a little bit to your own experience as student journalists and your journeys. So I know you've all had very different journeys as student journalists. So I'm curious about what surprised you throughout your journalism experience. Maybe Maria, you could go first.
Literally on my very first day as managing editor, the historic protests and arrests happened, of which I was part of the breaking news team doing the reporting on that. And doing that work, seeing how impactful it was, seeing how many people read our coverage and were getting their information from us. And then in the aftermath, seeing just how our administration responded to us, which betrayed just what impact we did have and what kind of impact we could have if it meant that admin were pulling our papers out of kiosks, if admin were telling us we're not allowed to do this anymore, that we're not allowed to do this kind of journalism. It really showed like just how much power there was in the stories we wrote and in the coverage we did. And it really showed me that even though student journalism gets a bad rap, honestly, as often being just another PR arm for many universities where, you cover campus events, you cover like arts on campus, bands that come to campus, kind of these like fluffy practice pieces for your real job in journalism down the line. That's certainly not all of it. There's inherent value in even the fluffiest piece that someone writes to get good at their job, but at the same time, there are people doing thoughtful, hard-hitting, well-researched investigative reporting that has sometimes taken months and hundreds of hours and multiple people, multiple teams of people to put together, that has been constructed in consultation with industry professionals, with mentors all across the nation. And so much work and love and passion goes into telling these stories and telling them well. And when protests started happening, and in the aftermath of that, as the university pursued its legal charges against the arrested individuals, being able to keep the community updated on that and assuring the community that, hey, even though times are tough right now, we are doing our best to get the news out there and to keep this spotlight shining on the university's actions for better or for worse. All of that has felt so personally impactful, and the testimonies we hear, the people who reach out to us, they all come together to suggest that the work you do as a journalist on a college campus might be some of the most important work you do in college in general.
For me, I guess the more politically salient one that has surprised me is how much scrutiny lies on student journalists. And that's heightened over the course of my 4 years at Yale, largely because of Israel-Palestine related tensions from the war in Gaza last year and the escalation in that conflict. And so the greater scrutiny has been really shocking to me, especially because so many student journalists are unpaid, just starting out, learning the ropes. And I think the industry broadly approaches student newsrooms as training grounds, right? That's how professional newsrooms think of university papers and other journalistic outlets. That is a little bit alarming to me in a lot of ways in this newly and exceedingly digitized environment where your training ground is still in the archive of the World Wide Web forever and ever and ever. And also being on the web forever and ever and ever, it means that more people across the country can access, pick up on, and more often than not, critique the kind of coverage that student journalists are doing. We lack the institutional resources and know-how to support journalists who might be going through things similar to what that student at Tufts went through when her visa was revoked for an op-ed, a relatively benign, I will say, op-ed that she had published in the Tufts campus paper. And so I think a lot about the scrutiny on student reporters now, how that's changed in this digital news economy, and how that is getting worse and incredibly alarming in this current political climate. So I guess that's like thing one that surprised me. Thing two, perhaps in a more uplifting note, is how similar the professional newsrooms that I have worked in have resembled my university paper environment. And I'm smiling while saying this because I think that it's been such a huge privilege for me to be like, okay, I'm graduating now. And I also just get to like do my college extracurricular for my entire life and also newly get paid to be doing that. It's an incredibly exciting reality. And so I have just loved that. And I feel so grateful to have experienced something in college that actually does closely resemble the structure and the vibes of the professional analog to this experience.
Yeah, those are really great points and great answer. Macy, last but not least, but do you want to also share?
Yeah, I think just echoing what Annika said too, that despite kind of this increased scrutiny and intimidation, um, there are still so many dedicated student journalists, and that has been an incredible thing to see, especially now that I'm in a leadership position. All of the incoming members of our team, really, after last year and after repression faced from the university, are not dissuaded from this industry. Um, and I think that gives me hope. I know that journalism in this country is really in crisis in a lot of ways. But I think that student journalists represent the future of this industry, and it is looking bright, regardless of what happens at the federal level. There are people that will not give up on it.
I love that answer, and I especially love how you said student journalists are the future of journalism, and that is looking bright no matter what is happening. And on that future, I'm curious how you all envision the future of student journalism to be, and what changes do you hope to see in that future?
The importance of student reporting will only grow, um, especially as newsrooms across the country are increasingly decimated by budgetary constraints and layoffs and buyouts and these really precarious situations of local press, especially. That's only going to raise the importance of college newsrooms operating as these local news environments in particular. I think that that's really important. I think the concurrent part of that is as higher education institutions become this primary battleground for the Trump administration, um, it becomes even more important to have diligent student reporters who are committed to covering their universities too, to offer clear narratives and honest narratives that might go against whatever the mainstream understanding of what's happening on campuses is. Students who are here understand these realities often better than like a broadcaster from a national news outlet can or even has the time to. And so that feels really important to me. I also would more broadly, and this is not about like professionalism, just like, student press in general, love to see some reckoning for like how student reporters are paid. There needs to be some way that reporters can be paid more fairly and more evenly because it really just is a job that students do. I think that press operates differently from a lot of other standard campus clubs because you are producing a product that is consumed by not just people on your campus, but broader communities. Um, and that is just work. It is labor that I think should be compensated in a fair and appropriate way, and it is too often not done so that way in current conditions.
Macy, Maria, do you want to add anything to Annika's answer?
I think a big part of strengthening support for student journalists as well includes getting other papers in contact with each other. I've actually very recently had the honor of being elected the president of the Texas Intercollegiate Press Association. And one of the things that I ran my campaign on is, hey, we have so many student papers across all the colleges and universities here at Texas, but we don't talk to each other, right? But we're all facing the same problems. We've all got these deportations happening on our campuses. We're all being affected by the same things happening in the state and national legislatures. We have so many stories in common. And what happens when instead of just one team writing an editorial, it's 10 teams signing off on it? What starts happening when we start information sharing not just within an org but across different papers? What happens when our stories start being more founded in statewide level affairs when we're able to dig deeply into multiple interconnected issues, see similarities or new threads or new stories that we might not have seen just because of our own limited resources and our own limited perspectives on our own campuses.
I love that student journalists should come together, and I think you all will be such great role models and mentors when the new generation of student journalists come in and start working. And to wrap this great conversation up, I'm wondering if each of you could offer one piece of advice to incoming college students interested in journalism or to fellow student journalists.
I guess one piece of advice I can give from, being in a situation where we're currently conflicting with administration, for any student journalists who end up in that kind of position, definitely start reaching out to resources like the Student Press Law Center early and start working with them on, start working with them on a game plan about how to approach the situation for sure. But more generally, remember that whoever is opposing you, whoever is saying that your journalism is not allowed to exist, whoever is saying that your coverage is not welcome on campus, all those like tall, intimidating looking enemies are never quite as powerful as you think. And student journalists often, we get the rep of being just kids, and people use that to dismiss the work we do. People use that as an excuse to justify censoring us under the guise of, oh, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they're writing about. But in doing so, they really, really underestimate us.
Yeah, I think, on that same note, but also on a more day-to-day level, I think every piece of criticism you receive means that you're making an impact in some way. And, for every critic, there's also someone who really is valuing what you're doing. And I just think it's important, especially for young journalists, to remember that impact does not come without friction a lot of times. So just to keep your head up in situations like that, trust that you are doing good work, have confidence in your reporting. And if you do, then just, know you're doing the right thing and you're making an impact.
Working at a student paper or a student radio station, it's something that sometimes would help define our college experience. And I think, that's what makes our college experience so unique. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Macy Henslick-Barron is a news and arts director at WKCR, Columbia's independent student-run radio station. Annika Aurora-Seth was editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News from spring 2023 to spring 2024. And Maria Schick is managing editor at The Retrograde, the independent student newspaper at the University of Texas at Dallas.
A major thank you to our intern, Kathy Wang, for producing this episode and hosting our conversation with student journalists. This episode of Disrupted was also produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Additional production help came from our intern, Angelica Gajewski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.